and we're going to try to reach to top of page 10b. So it's a short page 10a, which is basically starts the story of Purim. So it goes into a few pages of Agada, which is always easier yet more difficult at the same time. It's more God is very deep secrets of Torah, but at the same time it's a little easier, a little lighter than what we've been studying till now. Nothing wrong with studying something a little difficult, but either way, we're going to try to see if we could get there. Okay. We spoke last week. We're still going. This is the final mission so far that we're going to have about what's the difference between different locations. So, different ideas, mitzvahs or ideas or laws, etc. We compare, starting off with comparing the differences between the first month of Adar and second month of Adar in the event that there's a leap year. And we've also discussed other questions. Last week we discussed the different types of high priests, different types of altars. Now, again, just a quick. We're gonna try to manage do time management today. So the Moshe Rabbeinu in the desert after the golden calf comes down from the mountain on Motzi Yom Kippur, and he tells the Jewish people, we're going to be building a mishkan, a house for God, which is going to be a mishkan based on a structure of a tent kind of structure, which was of course built with beams and skin coverings. The fundamental difference between, and this is appropriate starting. So first of all, I forgot to wish everyone a Chodesh Tov, Chodesh Av, Chodesh Menachem Av. We remember the destruction of the temple. So the difference, the primary difference of many, but one of the main differences between the structure of the Beis HaMikdash and the structure of the Mishkan is the Mishkan was considered an oyel, a tent. It was also made, like Chassidus explains, of the four elements, meaning there was the earth, which is the base, there was the domem, that's the earth, there was tzameach, which is the beams, there was the chai, there was the animal skins. So then they had the person, the Kohen inside. The Beis HaMikdash was made only of domem, and like it's very little wood. If no wood was able to be in the Beis HaMikdash, only they had some sort of design wood in some sort of the structure of the roof. But the Beis HaMikdash had to be totally of stone. The Mishkan was built of different elements. So they had the wood frames and the skin covering. So hey Shuki. Now, Moshe Rabbeinu built the Mishkan. The Mishkan that was built by Moshe Rabbeinu lasted in different forms until the days of David, some way or another. But not really, because what happened was when they crossed over from the river, the Jordan River into Eretz Yisrael, they initially put up the Mishkan in Gilgal, and then they moved to Shiloh, which we spoke about at the end of last week's class. In Shiloh, the Mishkan stood in Shiloh for over close to 370 years. The structure of Shiloh, like we showed the picture last week, and here's different discoveries that they have in ancient Shiloh. And here we have this is Shiloh from a bird's eye perspective, from maybe a drone view. They've built a shul in a replica of what looked like the Beis HaMikdash or the Mishkan in Shiloh. So we see over here, there's the skin coverings like they had in Shiloh. The difference was instead of the beams, they had stone structure there. Obviously, the air conditioning little piece over here, that's in addition to the shul. They didn't have an air conditioning, but it was a structure. But it was the structure of the Mishkan. The Mishkan didn't sanctify Eretz Yisrael or Shiloh, for that matter, to make it a holy city. It was a city that hosted the Mishkan for many, many years. Like it says over here, the Mishkan was, how long does it say? The Mishkan stood for 360 years, I think, or 365 years. It stood for a very long time. The Mishkan was destroyed in the time of Eli, which is that, so then at that point, or at some point, they've buried anything that Moshe made had to be buried. It wasn't destroyed. It means nothing of Moshe's, like one of the foundations is that Moshe's emes Moshe is true, and therefore everything of Moshe is true. Anything he makes is truth, and therefore the Mishkan, anything Moshe built had to be hidden. It couldn't be destroyed. The Goyim, no nation could destroy the efforts of Moshe. Same thing really applies to David HaMelech. That's why the walls that King David built sunk in. They weren't destroyed. Okay. But after Shiloh was destroyed, and I guess the parts that Moshe didn't make, so they moved the Mizbeach to Nov and Givon. Nov and Givon was not really a Mishkan, as we definitely wasn't Shiloh. Nov is the city of priests that we learn about in the story of Saul, where Saul kills the priests of the city of Nov because they protected David. Why did David go to Nov? Because that's where the Mishkan was. I mean, whatever, that was where the Bama was. They call it a Bama. A Bama means the large altar, which we learned about last week. What type of sacrifices did they sacrifice on the large altar? Which types did they not? And how is the large altar different than a private altar? So that's the Bamas. But aside for all that, that was a kind of in between of the Mishkan. It had part of the elements of the Mishkan, and that after Saul killed out the city of Nov, it went to Givon. There's special laws that applied not just to the area of where the temple was, but how it affected Bikurim and how it affected other tithings, other mitzvahs that are connected to the Mishkan or the Beis HaMikdash were affected when the Mizbeach stood in Nov and Givon and brought down in different Mishnahs of their subjects when we know about Givon and Nov and about Bikurim, etc. The first fruit. Now, after David becomes king, it's in Givon still. There's some sort of, we lost the ark. The ark comes back and is placed somewhere around this structure of the Mishkan. And then David starts to prepare Jerusalem to be the city where they're going to build the temple, and Solomon builds the temple. Okay. So that's the so to say the life of the tabernacle in this Beis HaMikdash, and then of course Tisha B'Av, which is hopefully is already going to be a day of Mashiach. But if it doesn't, then it's going to be a day that we're going to remember and cry about the destruction of the first and second temple that was destroyed about 400 and something years after it was built by Shlomo Melech. Okay, there was laws that were affected by the building of Shiloh and the building of the Beis HaMikdash, and that's what we're going to discuss in this Mishnah. The Mishnah says like this: Ein bein Shiloh li Yerushalayim. What is the difference between Shiloh and Jerusalem? Again, Shiloh hosted this structure of the Mishkan. It means it had the walls, like we saw in the picture before, but it was still basically a Mishkan. It had to have the coverings. It was not a temple, but it stood for 300 and so years. So what's the difference between Shiloh and Jerusalem? There's no difference. There's two reasons to this law. What is the law? The law is that we have different levels of kedusha, where different things are eaten. There's different camps. There's things that have to be eaten in the temple, and there's things that could be eaten in the area of the temple, meaning what we would call Jerusalem. There's certain kachim kalim, where the word kachim kalim, which is, as he translated here, of lesser sanctity. Okay. So offerings of lesser sanctity could be eaten in the whole city of Jerusalem. Then we have second tithings. Second tithings is what? Is when Rabbi Steinjas is going to say that after you give the first tithings, we have to give certain years, we have to bring second tithings to Jerusalem and eat the fruits in Jerusalem. The first fruit also has to be brought to Jerusalem. There's certain things that are Jerusalem-based. Those things have to be eaten in the city of Jerusalem. In Shiloh, it wasn't called the city of Jerusalem. So what defined these things? The lesser sanctified sacrifices. And the second tithings, what was the boundaries that you had to eat it in? Now, in the laws of Ma'aser Sheni, there's a lot of strict laws. If you're to take the second tithing out of the city, or you take kachim kalim, less sanctified karbanos sacrifices outside the city, it affects the ability to, you can't bring it back in. It's chaimus koleitas. There's all these laws about the boundaries of the city of Jerusalem that locks in, so to say, these things. How does that work with Shiloh? Two reasons why the question is. One, Shiloh was not a walled city. And also, we're going to see that there's a more mystical reason, because there was a gift to Shiloh. It was in the land of Joseph, and as being in the land of Joseph, meaning the descendants of Joseph, because it was in Ephraim, so therefore God gifted Joseph for his Hebrews for holding up, for not having relations with the wife of Potiphar. He was gifted this idea, which is that Shiloh, you could eat it b'chol haroya. In Shiloh, as long as you could see the tabernacle, you could see it from a distance. Then you could eat the less sanctified one, 9b at the bottom. You could eat the less sanctified sacrifices and the second tithings. There's no boundary, so to say. The limit is what you could see. If you see the tabernacle, you could eat it. Jerusalem, it has to be within the walls. Outside the walls, you can't eat second tithings, and you can't eat less sanctified sacrifices. So Tosafos says, B'chol araya, b'chol makom she'er chaliros, wherever you could see the tabernacle, around Shiloh, misham es Shiloh, or perkbas in Zvachim yalf time, in Zvachim it learns the reason. Again, the reason is that's brought down that Rabbi Vo says, it says Bein Paras Yosef, Bein Paras Ayli Ayin. So because he didn't give in to his temptation of his eyes, God blessed him that whoever sees Shiloh could eat the second tithings and could eat the less sanctified sacrifices as a gift to Yosef. But in Jerusalem, it's the walls. All right, let's see the footnotes of Rabbi Steinsaltz, Rabbi Evan Yisrael. The simple reason for this is because Shiloh was open and walled. It's like Steinsaltz says, the simple reason is that Shiloh had no wall. So how could you define the space? And had no defined boundary. Its domain, similar to the camp of the Israelites in the desert, included all places from which Shiloh or the tabernacle could be seen. So says the Jerusalem Talmud. In the tractate Zvachim, this is explained in another way. Since Shiloh was in the tribal territory of Joseph, meaning Joseph's descendants, and because Joseph resisted sinning and did not let his eyes wander inappropriately, such as with regard to Potiphar's wife, he was rewarded that in his tribal territory offerings offering sacrifice in Shiloh may be eaten anywhere within the eyeshot of the town of Shiloh, okay, or the tabernacle. So therefore that's the one difference. Okay, Reb Steinsaltz says, what is Shiloh? Other than the Temple of Jerusalem, the divine presence rested in three places in Eretz Yisrael. Shiloh, where the tabernacle was erected after the Jewish people entered the land. Again, it wasn't right away. First, it was put up in Gilgal, and after Gilgal, they put it up in Shiloh. And then Nob and Gibon. So, but we don't count really Gilgal as a place. We count Shiloh, Nob, and Gibon. So again, Nob was the city of priests that I asked someone, where's that location today? They seem to think it's in what we know today as Ramat Beit Shlomo or in Givat Sefartit, which is in the vicinity. Today it's the city of Jerusalem, but it's the new city. Or Gibon, I'm not sure exactly where Gibon is. Referring to here as great altars, the great altars. According to the Gemara tractate Tzvachim 118b, the tabernacle stood in Shiloh for 369 years. So it was a long time that it was in Shiloh. And that's all the time of the judges, basically, of Joshua and the judges. And in Nob and Givon for a total of 57 years. The city of Shiloh, which was located in the tribal land of Ephraim, see this in Shoftim, is approximately 35 kilometers north of Jerusalem. Yeah, so it's north, if I'm not mistaken, it's north, it's because it's in the Shtachim, so it's northeast of Yerushalayim. On the ancient mountain ridge road that traverses the country from the north to the south, and a bit less than 16 kilometers south of the city of Shechem. Okay, so if you're driving up towards, I think, the Highway 60, it's around that area. In modern day settlement of Shiloh, remnants of the tabernacle were discovered, and a synagogue was built commemorating the tabernacle, as we saw the pictures before. Again, this picture over here of the shul that was built as a replica today, standing today in Shiloh. We know that the American ambassador, Mike Huckabee, is very into the city of Shiloh. He goes there all the time. His children discovered certain things from the times of the tabernacle. It's a big deal. The Christian communities are or the evangelistic Christian community is very into the city and the story of Shiloh. Okay. Meiser Sheni, what is the second tithings? So he says, this is the tithe separated after the Truma for the priests and for the and the first tithe for the Levites. Okay, so we have Truma, the Meiser Rishon. Truma is what you give to the priests. You have to remember, in theory, the priest, we don't see it today. But back in the day, in the desert, right? How many priests were there? There were 4. There were only 4 places to wash your hands in the kior. That's a question how that worked, but in the beginning there was for Aaron, Elazar, Itamar, and Pinchas. There was a place for 4 people to wash their hands. There are 4 kohanim. If anyone goes to synagogue today, at least I'm a Levite, so I'm more conscious of it. There's usually one Levite for 20 kohanim. At least in my communities where I hang out, I'm usually a single Levite. There's many more kohanim than Levites. There's a reason for that, a few reasons for that. But either way, the idea was initially there should be more Levites than kohanim. When there was 4 kohanim, there was 25,000 Levites. how it made such a switch is interesting. But so therefore the tithings was kind of the truma was kind of less. There's no real amount you have to give truma, but tithings there's 10% goes to the Levite, and the Levite has to give from his tithing 10% back to the Kohen. Okay, so they were separated. Second tithing, then after that. So first of all, you have to give truma, and ma'aser has to go to Levites and Kohen. Second, after that, you have to give a second tithing. The second tithing is called ma'aser sheni. Was separated during the first, second, fourth, and fifth years of the sabbatical. So if every sabbatical cycle, the first year of the sabbatical cycle, the second year, the fourth year, not the third year, the fifth year, not the sixth year, you had to separate second tithings. After the second tithing was designated, it had to be taken to Jerusalem to be eaten there by its owner. So it wasn't given as a gift to anyone. It was for you, but you had to take it to Jerusalem or its value to Jerusalem. And where could you eat it? Only in the walls. If you went to Shiloh in the times of the Mishkan, you could eat it at any space that you could see the tabernacle. If the journey to Jerusalem was too long and therefore it was difficult to take the second tithings there, or if the produce became ritually impure, it could be redeemed for an equivalent sum of money. If the owner redeemed his own produce, he was required to add 1/5 of its value. If he redeemed the second tithing produce by selling it to others, there's no need to add the 1/5 in the value. The redemption money was taken to Jerusalem, where it had been spent on food only. Second tithings could be redeemed only with minted coins bearing an imprint. Unstamped coins or promissory notes, questions if dollars would help today, could not be used today. Second tithing is still redeemed, but in a nominal sum. As the absence of the temple, it is no longer brought to Jerusalem. The halachah of the second tithing is discussed in tractate Ma'aser Sheni. There's a whole tractate that deals with Ma'aser Sheni. Where can you eat the second tithing that you have to bring the first, second, fourth, fifth years? You have to bring it to Jerusalem within the walls. What are kachim kalim? Offerings of lesser sanctity, and second tithings, produce may be eaten only within the walls of Jerusalem. So says the Rambam. Okay, so that is one difference between Shiloh and the temple. A second difference is V'kani says that both with regard to Jerusalem and Shiloh, kachim kalim necholim fnim nakloim kachim, the more severe sanctified sacrifices have to be eaten lifnim min hakloim. It has to be eaten with inside the what we would know today as the azara, within the temple space. You can't eat it outside the temple space. It has to be eaten what they called the tabernacle courtyard of Shiloh was surrounded by kloim as hangings. In those hangings, you had to eat the Kohanim had to eat the kachim, the more sanctified ones in Shiloh. Okay, now before we turn the page. It says offerings of the most sacred order are to eat in the temple courtyard in Jerusalem. One who eats an olive bulk of those offerings outside the courtyard is flogged, gets malchus. Okay, and that in the Mishkan they had yes, Aaron.
What's the reason for eating everything in the exact certain space? Why not just be in Jerusalem for say, and you could eat it anywhere?
That's the laws of sanctity. Because there's different levels of sanctity. Something that's kachim, that's a sanctified sacrifice, is sanctified to the extent that it can't be taken once it's sacrificed, cannot be taken out of the Temple Mount. It's a law of sanctity. It means the lesser sanctified ones could be eaten in Jerusalem. In the Jewish people's camp, there was what's called the Mishkan. There was the camp of the Levites. There's the camp of the Jewish people. There's different levels of kedusha, and the different levels of holiness correspond to also affect the levels of how you could behave and where you can be when it comes to eating or being in the presence of the temple.
Okay, so they did sacrifices. What about the tithings that you bring, the food you bring from your own home?
So the second tithings that was able to be eaten in Jerusalem. He says only the more sanctified ones have to be eaten in the temple courtyard. Okay, now this is where our subject of the Talmud comes in. What happens after Shiloh fell, was destroyed? And those 52 or 54 years that we had Nov and Givon. So Nov and Givon didn't have the sanctity of Shiloh. The sanctity of the building was only where you couldn't have bamais, you weren't allowed to set up your own private altar. That as long as Shiloh was standing, you couldn't do that. Once Shiloh fell, until Jerusalem was built, we said it was 50 odd years, right? There was some sort of tabernacle, what we call it, We call them the big altars because they weren't really the tabernacle. So what happens after Shiloh when they put up the Nov and Givon? So it says, Yeshar Chereh Heter. You were allowed to build private altars because it didn't have the exclusivity that Shiloh had. Ukedushas Yerushalayim Ein Chereh Heter. And this is where our Mishnah goes in, which comes into effect till today. After Jerusalem was set up by Shlomo, and now this is becoming, we're going to learn it fast. It doesn't look like we're going to get to where I want to get to today, but we're going to learn it. We're going to learn the subject fast, but the subject is very deep because the question is, what did Shlomo and David do? Maybe Samuel, when they sanctified Jerusalem, right? David HaMelech was not allowed to build a temple, but he sanctified it. And then Shlomo sanctified it. What was the effect of that sanctification? And was there a difference between the sanctification of the first temple and the second temple? It means when we say today that Jerusalem's a holy city, is that still a statement? Or is it a concept of holiness? Or is Jerusalem actually a holy city? So these are the questions. So our Mishnah, what we're learning right now, says that Shiloh, for instance, Shiloh, like I said, Mike Huckabee loves to go to Shiloh. He goes there all the time. Is Shiloh considered a holy city for Jews? No. It hosted the tabernacle for 369 years, but it didn't become a holy city. And also didn't affect exclusivity. Once Shiloh fell, you were allowed to put up private altars. But after Jerusalem, Kedushas Yerushalayim Ein Chereh Heter. Once Jerusalem was sanctified, there was no longer the ability to put up a private bama, meaning to say, this is a question that comes up today. Can a person put up an altar today and sacrifice outside of Jerusalem? And we're going to see that there's a Tosfos that discusses that there's a machlokes, even if we could do it with the question now, like I said, people are grabbing goats every once in a while. Before Passover, you read on the news, some fellow was caught with a goat in his car. What's wrong with having a goat in your car? There's no laws against goat in your car, but if they think that you're going to take the goat to Temple Mount, so then they'll arrest you, 100 miles away. But that's just the way things work in Israel. But in theory, what's the idea? That they're trying to get into Temple Mount to sacrifice the Paschal lamb. Is that allowed? It's not even so simple. That's a discussion. Can you sacrifice today where the altar is? Or was when the temple stood? What kind of sanctification did Yerushalayim have? So here he's saying, Kedushas Yerushalayim Ein Chereh Heter. Our Mishnah says something's clear. Once Jerusalem was set up, that is the place of sacrifice. One is not allowed to have a private sacrifice outside of Jerusalem. So let's see Rashi. Rashi says, Yesh Chereh Heter, Kishachar Shiloh. Once Shiloh was destroyed, in the 50 so years between Shiloh and the temple, which we said the big altars were in Givon and Nov, Kishachar Shiloh Hutra Habamas. Private altars were allowed. Kedisam Sech Zvachim, as we learn in the tractate of Zvachim, that deal with the laws of sacrifices. Like it says, there's a verse to support this law. Because it says, Kiloi Basam Adata El Hamanucha Zu Shiloi Shenachu Melichvoish. Means that God talks about Shiloh. Shiloh was not a no place. It wasn't just a technical place. It is a holy place. God called it Menucha, my place of resting. But just like when a person does a rest stop, it's not permanent. That's why Shiloh's not permanent, because it only says Menucha. Zu Shiloh Shenachu Melichvoish. When they stopped conquering and they set up base, for 369 years, the city of Shiloh hosted the tabernacle. But Nachala, my inheritance, the pasuk continues, Zu Yerushalayim, that's Jerusalem. Lama Cholko Akasif, why does the Torah make a difference between Nachla and Menucha? To tell us that between the destruction of Shiloh and the putting up of the temple in Jerusalem, those 52 or 4 years, I forget, were allowed to have private bamis. No longer was there a central location that was exclusive for sacrifices. And a private bama means you could have in your backyard a private altar that you could sacrifice. Now again, like I said, the Jewish people suffered from this. This was a law. If you open up the book of Kings, you're going to read over and over and over and over again. The Jewish people did not stop sacrificing private sacrifices. They'll talk about the greatest kings, and they'll say this king was very great and he eradicated all the idol worship and everything, but he couldn't get rid of the bummas. What are the bummas? They were for God, but it was a private altar, and people just couldn't get rid. They couldn't separate themselves from that. That's not something he suffered from in the second temple. At the end, I think Chizkiyahu and Yeshayahu, the later good kings got it out. But in the earlier years, they had a problem. They suffered from it. What's the psychological of it? If it's a sacrifice for God, they weren't serving it for idols. They were sacrificing for God. But if you ask yourself, it's the idea of ganva pum machtarte rachmana kaira. The thief, before he goes into or she goes into rob, she calls out to God. Same thing. Even though God doesn't want your altar, right? God wants you to do sacrifice in the temple. But the Jewish people nevertheless put up altars for God. Now we're going to see how this affects our Gemara going forward. Rabbi Yitzchak. Rabbi Yitzchak says, Shemati, I heard. Shemakrivim Beis Chonyo bizman hazeh. Today, in the house of Chunya, we'll learn about that in a second, you could sacrifice today. What's bizman hazeh? I mean, after the destruction of the temple. Meaning to say, our Mishnah says that once Shiloh was destroyed, or no longer standing, those 52 or 4 years of Nov and Givon, everyone was able to sacrifice in their backyard. Rabbi Yitzchak says, based on that, he says the same thing applies to Jerusalem. He doesn't agree with our Mishnah. Our Mishnah says that Jerusalem stopped that even after the temple was destroyed, the first and second temple, you no longer could put up a private altar. Now, a newsflash: when they came back, this is part of the struggle of the subject, when they came back with Ezra, before Ezra, when they came back with Zerubbabel, and until Ezra built a second temple, means in the second Aliyah from Bavel after the destruction of the first temple, they immediately put up an altar for 50-something years, 27, we'll see in a second, for a certain amount of time, until the second temple was put up, they sacrificed. There was no temple, but they knew, the prophets came and told them exactly where Shlomo Melech's Mizbeach was, so the altar was. So you couldn't just do it in Shiloh, you had to do it in Jerusalem, exactly where the altar was. So you see clearly, you can't just, even though the temple wasn't standing. But Rabbi Yitzchak says that I heard that today you could sacrifice, meaning after the destruction of the second temple, you could sacrifice in the house of Chunya. Well, what is the house of Chunya? We'll see in a second. So what does he hold? Number one, he holds that the Beis Chonyo lav Beis Avodah Zarah. The house of Chunya was not a house of idol worship, which is a discussion in the Gemara Menachos at the end. Because sovereign, he also holds Kedusha Rishona Kichel L'Shaitiv L'Kichel L'Slava. When David and Shlomo sanctified, and then Ezra, they built a second temple, it was temporary, it wasn't forever, it was not for Lasad Lavi. It was only for the time that the temple stood. Once the temple was destroyed, you could sacrifice in the house of Chunya. What's the house of Chunya? So instead of just telling you the story, we're going to read from the Rambam. The Rambam has, besides the laws of the Yad HaChazaka, the Rambam has what's called Pirush Mishnayos LaRambam, the Rambam's translation of the Mishnah. In the tractate of Menachos, the Rambam tells us the story, which really the Gemara tells us, but the Rambam tells us because the story has different versions. If you go to Josephus, it has its version, will tell us the story of the house of Chunya. If so, what's the basis of this discussion? If someone says Haray Elai Oilaf, someone takes upon themselves a donation to bring a burnt sacrifice to the temple, he must bring it to the Beis HaMikdash. If he brought it to the Beis Chonyo, if he brought it to the house of Chunya, the Kohen, then it's not considered fulfilling your vow. Now, the Mishnah continues in Menachos, the Kohanim who served in Beis Chonyo may not serve in the Beis HaMikdash. A Kohen who served in the house of Chunya cannot serve in the Beis HaMikdash. What is the story of the house of Chunya? So the Rambam tells us the story, which is basically taken from the Gemara. Shimon HaTzadik, from whom we received the Misorah. I mean, Shimon HaTzadik was, what do we know about Shimon HaTzadik? Shimon HaTzadik is in the first Mishnahs of Pirkei Avos, when we learn about the tradition of Torah, Shimon HaTzadik is the times of the second temple. He's from the last of the members of the Great Assembly. So it means he's from the groups of Ezra, Mordechai, the people that brought over or kept the Jewish people, kept the faith, so to say, from the first temple to the second temple, primarily in the time of the second temple. They came in but they're in the time in the beginning of the second temple. Ezra, Nehemiah, the different peoples and the members of the Great Assembly who put up the second temple, the Shtar Ramona. They did all the kind of reestablished Judaism in the times of the second temple. The last of the members of the Great Assembly is Shimon the Righteous, who is the high priest for 40 years. So he's part of the Masorah, as we explained at the beginning of the Sefer, means the Rambam. This is all a translation from the Rambam. One was blessed by Hashem with long life and tranquility. He had two sons, and one name was Chonyo and one name was Shimi. So Shimon the Righteous is in the times of the second temple. We know from the stories that Shimon HaTzadik lived in the time of Alexander the Great. So when Alexander the Great came and conquered the world, or conquered the civilized world, let's say from the Persians, and came to Eretz Yisrael, all the Gemaras that we have, Shimon HaTzadik was the one who goes and meets him. He had two sons. One son was called Chunya, and son was called Shimi. Shimi was the older brother, but Chunya was the more proficient in the avoda. It means he was more of a quality. He was more. The Gemara discusses this in Menachos. What was this character of the two sons? But basically, Chunya was the one that knew the service better than his older brother Shimi. He was older than his older brother Shimi was older than him by 2.5 years. Therefore, Shimon HaTzadik instructed that Chunya, although younger, should be succeed him as a Kohen Gadol. So when he passed away, he knew he was going to pass away. The Gemara Menachos says that he went into the temple on Yom Kippur, and he usually was accompanied by an angel in white. This year, he was accompanied by the angel in black, and he knew that meant that he's going to die, and he died 7 days after Sukkot. Before he died, which he knew he was going to die, he gave a tzavah, right? He gave a will. In his will, he succeeded. He gave that his younger son, Chunya, because he was more knowledgeable in the laws of being a high priest, should be the high priest, and he passed over his older son, Shimi. However, Chunya removed the Bigdei Kahuna Gedola from himself and dressed his brother Shimi in them. Chunya decided not to take his father's appointment, and he yielded on behalf of his older brother, appointing him Kohen Gadol after their father. Afterwards, Chunya regretted what he had done. He regretted that he yielded. His father gave him the high priest. He was younger than Shimi, but now he regretted that he made Shimi the high priest. This is machlekes. In the Gemara of Menachos, there's two opinions of what happened. The Rambam is taking this opinion. He began plotting to have his brother killed so that he could regain the position of Kohen Gadol. Since it was one of the Yesodis of the Torah, once someone is elevated to a position of Kedusha, he is not demoted unless he becomes disqualified. So he wanted to disqualify his brother from being high priest. We follow the principle of Milan B'Kodesh Ve'en Maridin. Once someone gets elevated, he can't go down. He ascended in holiness. He does not descend. Furthermore, there can only be one Kohen Gadol in the world, like we learned. You can only have one Kohen Gadol. So we learned this last week between the one who comes in and replaces. So here, Chunya wanted the job again, but the only way he could get the job is he has to get Shimi out of the way. Chunya therefore devised a scheme. He told Shimi, "Come and I will teach you the Seder Havoda and train you in the service." So Chunya knew the service better than his older brother. He tells him, "I'm going to teach you how to be high priest." He dressed Shimi in the clothing that was not fit for Avoda, means he put him in a belt and he guarded him with the belt, unlike the one worn by Kohanim. In addition, the garments and belt resembled women's clothing of the time. He dressed him in women's clothing. In the Gemara Menachos, it says he dressed him in his wife's clothing, as to show that he did it as a sign of his love for his wife or his girlfriend. He then brought him near the Mizbeach merely to demonstrate the avoda, not for him to actually perform the avoda, because one who's mechusar begadim is prohibited from serving, as has already been explained. Meaning, Choni, what we're learning from this, the Rambam takes the opinion that Choni was doing everything properly. He was a God-fearing person who is like this mamish, the story of the 3 weeks, right? He was struggling with tremendous sinas chinam, hate. So he was religious, but he was suffering with hate. So he wouldn't do a violation of the Torah. He just dressed his brother in woman's clothing and his wife's clothing. Doesn't tell him to do anything, just to stand there. Because if you do something, that's already against the law. Even though this whole exercise is against the law of loving your fellow Jew, right? He was having hate and jealousy. But nevertheless, his father thought he was appropriate to be the high priest. What does he do? Chani then left and he went to the Kohanim in Beis HaMikdash. He goes to the Kohanim. He tells them, "My brother has a woman with him with whom he's involved, either his wife or his girlfriend. These garments belong to her, and he swore that on the day he becomes Kohen Gadol, he would wear the clothing while approaching the Mizbeach, so that she would see how much he loved her. Now he has fulfilled the promise." He goes, "Look, my brother's wearing woman's clothing because he has a girlfriend. He wanted to show her his love, that he's going to be, the day he becomes Kohen Gadol, he's going to put on her clothing." Right? And how did the Kohanim react to that? They went nuts. The Kohanim immediately rushed to kill Shimi. They went to kill him for a desecration of the service of the high priest, because of the terrible chilul of the Mikdash implied by this act, the strange clothing and then he was wearing some seemed to be to corroborate Chonya's stories. And when they see Shimi, he's wearing a woman's clothing. They see that the story is true. Shimi begged them to hear him out before passing judgment. They agreed, and he explained his brother had tricked him. So Shimi tells the whole story, that his father made Choni high priest. He goes and yields, and then he dresses me up in women's clothing. After thoroughly investigating the matter, they established that Shimi was completely innocent and Choni was guilty one. His entire scheme had been an attempt to reclaim the Kahuna Gedolah, mocking the Mizbeach in the Vod in the process. When they realized what he did, the people then sought to kill Chonya. Now the Kohanim decided they're going to kill Chonya for making such a desecration for his own ego. He escaped to the king's palace. I'm not sure what the king was, but the king could not protect him, maybe the governor at the time. From the entire Jewish people who were pursuing him, Chonya fled Yerushalayim to Alexandria of Egypt. So where did he go? He went to Alexandria of Egypt, which was a Jewish community from the times of the destruction of the first temple. Then there he built a structure patterned after the Beis HaMikdash. It's called Beis Chonyo. Erected a Mizbeach and offered karbanas there l'shem Shemayim. So the Rambam takes the opinion, again, it's machlokes in the Gemara, in Menachos. The Rambam takes the opinion that what did he do? He went to Egypt, Alexandria of Egypt, put up a temple exactly as a replica of the Holy Temple in Jerusalem, and sacrificed for God. So this is where the Chazal say Beis Chonyo was not a Beis Avodah Zarah. It means it wasn't a house of idol worship. Rather, he violated the pasuk Pen Tala Olasecha B'chol Mokim Asher Tira. Do not offer the karbanos where you choose. So according to Rambam, what does he violate by building this temple? He violates building a temple outside Jerusalem. It means God made a law, passed a law, says you're not allowed to build a temple wherever you want. You can't build a Mizbeach, and he goes and builds it, not in Jerusalem, he builds it in Egypt. So he violates, according to Rambam, he's violating the law. Not everyone agrees. Tosfos doesn't agree with that. Tosfos holds that he wasn't violating any law. Because then surely, how could you have a sacrifice? Tosfos says that he was sacrificing for the Noahites. It was for Gentiles. The prohibition of building a second temple or building a temple outside Jerusalem is only applicable to sacrifices for Jews. He built a temple for Gentiles. Righteous Gentiles, the Bnei Noach, who wanted to sacrifice for God, and there's no violation for them to do it. So he figured he wanted a job. He built a tabernacle, which stood, by the way, the house of Chonyo stood for hundreds of years. It outlasted the second temple. It was again destroyed by the Romans when they destroyed the Jewish community of Alexandria. A group known as the Kabitzar gathered around him together with others who joined them. He drew them close to Avodas Hashem. He had influence. Again, there's a very psychological to the story, because in the Menachos it tells us the other opinion. The other opinion was that Shimon HaTzadik appointed Chani, and Shimi was jealous. So Shimi dressed up his brother Chani in women's clothing, and then the Kohanim wanted to kill him. He ran away and he built a temple for Avodah Zarah. That's one opinion. Rabbi Yehuda is the opinion of the Rambam, which is that he gathered people away. It means he struggled, right? He struggled. He was a God-fearing person. That's why his father thought he should be high priest. But at the same time, he struggled with jealousy and he struggled with ego. So he wants to do what Hashem wants. So he builds a house of God for the people, the Kubitzers and others, to bring them close to Avodah Hashem, which seems that the Rambam also agrees with Tosfos, that he primarily built the temple for Gentiles. His influence among them grew. They appointed him as their Kohen, and the Egyptians served Hashem there. So seemingly the Rambam agrees with Tosfos. So I guess either the question is if the Rambam holds that even building a house for Gentiles is prohibited outside of Jerusalem, or if he was doing it both. He was serving for God and for the Gentiles. But the Rambam seems to believe that he also built a temple for the Gentiles, bringing karbanos according to what he taught them. And there's a prophecy in Yeshaya that says, on that day there shall be an altar for Hashem in the midst of Egypt. And that's the story. That building stood for 200 years, says the Rambam. The house of Chani stood for 200 years. Nevertheless, everyone agrees that any korban brought there, or any similar place, is not a valid korban. An animal slaughtered there is halachically no different than if it simply been strangled or improperly slaughtered. The Mishnah says that such a person is yotze because is comparable to someone who says Harei alai oila on condition that I will not be responsible if it's lost. Therefore, he fulfills according to his neder, even though the animal is not brought as a vowed carbon. Okay, that law is connected to the laws of vows. Rabbi Shimon disagrees and holds that it never attained kedushas carbon at all, since he explicitly conditioned it upon Beis Chonyo. Therefore, it remains ordinary, non-concentrated meat, and may even be sold. May even be sold and eaten. It's not holy at all. The same idea applies to the Nazareth. Okay. From here, so this is the law of Beis Chonyo. So let's go back to our Gemara. So Rabbi Yitzchak says, Shemaiti, I heard. Shemakriv and Beis Chonyo was manizet. So what do you see from this statement? Two things. Number one, he holds that for certainly the house of Chonyo was not a house of idol worship. He holds the opinion of the Rambam, which is the opinion of Rabbi Yehud in the Gemara Menachos, that the house of Chonyo was a house of service of God. And now that the temple is no longer standing, so no longer is there a prohibition of sacrificing in the house of Chonyo, because you don't have to sacrifice in Jerusalem anymore. Not only that, you don't have to sacrifice in Israel anymore, in Eretz Yisrael. Kasavar Beis Chonyo, lav Beis Zari, Kasavar Kedushas Shoni, Kishel Shadi, like Kishel Lav. It was only temporary. Once the temple is destroyed, there's no more significance to Jerusalem. There's no more significance, evidently, to Eretz Yisrael, and therefore the house of Chonyo, which is a house of for God, you could sacrifice there. And it did stand after the destruction of the temple. Beis Chonyo, Mizbeach Chonyo, B'noi Shel Shimon HaTzadik, B'ma B'Mitzrayim, he built an altar in Egypt. The Shem Shemaim. So Rashi holds that, again, like the Rambam, that the temple was built for God. As it says in the tractate Menachos, although there's a machlekes there, there's an argument. Although there is an opinion, evidently not accepted opinion, that the house of Chonyo was built just for idols, then it's totally, obviously, not a place for Jewish person or Gentile for that matter to sacrifice. Therefore, he holds that once Jerusalem was destroyed and the temple was destroyed, it doesn't make Jerusalem exclusive for service, for sacrifices, and therefore, if a person is in Egypt, you could sacrifice in the house of Chonyo. So says the opinion of Rabbi Yitzchak. Once the house is destroyed, you could build it. Tosfos is going to ask a question both in Rashi and Rambam. Tosfos asks, Tosfos asks one question. One question he asks is that how could you? There's another problem. The rabbis have instituted that any land outside of Eretz Yisrael, this is a law that maybe some people don't realize. There's a law of impurity called the Beis HaPras. Beis HaPras is if you have a graveyard or an old graveyard that's been worked over, and we don't know if there's graves there or not, so then it's a questionable place of impurity. If there's certain ways of purifying a Beis HaPras, Beis HaPras means if it's been plowed and therefore there's bones all over the place, it becomes a place of impurity, and it affects the laws of tithings, the laws of kohanim, the laws of impurity. Now, the rabbis said any place outside the border of Eretz Yisrael is tamei. Meaning to say, today, if you are to walk north, south, now you can't do it because of other reasons. Or if you take a plane, once you land in Chutz La'aretz is a makim tamei. Eretz Yisrael is a makim tahor. Eretz Yisrael is a pure place. And Chutz La'aretz, by definition of being outside of Eretz Yisrael, the rabbis have said it's impure, which means any animal there is impure. So how could the house of Chonyo be a house of sacrifice for God today even? Because let's say Rabbi Yitzchak says the temple fell. Jerusalem is no longer exclusive. So I could go to the house of Chonyo, but the problem is the house of Chonyo is not in Tiberia. It's in Egypt. Egypt is outside of Eretz Yisrael. So it's being sacrificed in a place that's not pure. So Tosfos asked that question. The rabbis have instituted that any place out of Eretz Yisrael, whether it's halachically tamei or not, is considered a makim tamei. So the Tosfos answers that maybe in this case it wouldn't be effective, that rabbinic law, because you could say because biblically you can sacrifice there, it wouldn't apply to the house of Chonyo. Again, Tosfos says another thing. Tosfos is an opinion that the house of Chonyo was not in Menachos. Tosfos says that the Rabbeinu Tam, I think, says they did not sacrifice in the house of Chonyo for Jews. It was only a place of sacrifice for Gentiles. B'nai Noach. There's a lot of other questions about this law. One question is that the house of Chonyo what basically Rabbi Yitzchak is trying to say is that the house of Chunya would be comparable to Nov and Givon in the times of the destruction of Shiloh, or after the destruction of Shiloh. Now, we learned last week that there's a difference between the great altar, which would be Nov and Givon, and a private altar. The problem is, according to some halachic authorities, you can't erect a replica temple, meaning a Bama Gedola, in outside of Eretz Yisrael, because it has to be in Eretz Yisrael and there has to be a king. You can't just set up a big altar. The big altars that were set up by people that were of importance. So even the house of Chunya, because it's in Chutz La'aretz, you can't just set up. How could it be considered a Bam Gedolah? And we learned you can't sacrifice. So there's different answers. Maybe you only sacrifice for Goyim. Maybe you only sacrifice small sacrifices, which we said you can do in a private one. All right. So the Gemara says D'chsiv. Well, how does he know? How does Rabbi Yitzchak say? What's the proof that you could sacrifice in the house of Chunya today? Because it's not today. It's not standing, but it had been standing. It says Kiloi basem adata le menucha v'anachla. Menucha is Shiloi, nachla is Yerushalayim. He learns the verse differently than we learned before. Not that the terminology difference of menucha and nachla are coming to differentiate between Shiloh and Yerushalayim. That Shiloh is only menucha and the Beis HaMikdash is nachla. And the reason why we divide in between to show that in between you could put up the bamais katanas, you could put up this private altars in the times of Nov and Givon. He says. Menucha zu Shilei, nachla zu Yerushalayim. Makish nachla menucha. Ma menucha yesh acharei hater. Af nachla yesh acharei hater. Just like after Shiloh, you could put up private altars. So too after Jerusalem, once it's destroyed, you could put up private altars. And therefore, notwithstanding all the questions we had, the questions of Tosfos, the question of the Mikdash David, of how could you have a big temple outside of Israel, but in theory, whatever those answers are, according to Rabbi Yitzchak, the house of Chunya would be a house that you could sacrifice it. Amar Lei, he said, the rabbis don't accept this statement. Amart, did you really say that? Did you really say that you could sacrifice today in the house of Chunya? Means in a private temple outside of Eretz Yisrael? Amar Luloi, he backtracked. He said, I never said that. Amar Rava, so Rava said, Alikim. Alikim is an expression of I swear. Amar, Vigamrin Lamine, I heard it in your name that you did say that. So why are you saying you didn't say that? So why did he walk it back? The question is, why did he have to walk back the statement? He had enough. There's a lot of questions on this. The question is, why would he initially have said the statement in the first place? He wasn't just a person who said things. He was a rabbi of the Mishnah, of the Talmud, right? So why would he have said something? Because there's our Mishnah. Our Mishnah says clearly that you can't sacrifice after the Beis HaMikdash. And that's what we learned the Pasuk El Menucha El Menachela. And there's going to be another Mishnah that says it. So why would he? Well, what's the basis of him saying that you can do it? What was his even thinking of saying you can do it? So he has we're going to answer that question. But first, he backtracks his statement. So Rav Steinzat says the Rashba writes that there's no definitive proof from here that Rav Yitzchak completely retracted his opinion. Why? In other places in the Gemara, there are cases where one of the sages learned a certain matter from his teacher. When the matter was challenged from various sources, although he continued to hold in accordance with that which he had received from his teacher, rather than enter into a debate over the matter, he attempted to evade the challenge by saying he never said it. So Rashba says there's no proof that he never said it. Could be he did say it. He had his reasons for saying it. We're going to figure out why. And he just backtracked because he didn't want to get into debate. My Tamar Kod, but the Gemara says, why did he retract it? Mishum Kashya, the Rav Mari, because we have a question on Mari. The Meiser Mari asked the question. Kedusha Shili Yesh Acharei Heter, Kedusha Shilai Men Acharei Heter. We have a clear Mishnah. Our Mishnah says that we just learned that says that Yerushalayim is exclusive, and even after Yerushalayim is destroyed, is never permissible against the sacrifice outside of Yerushalayim. So how could Rabbi Yitzchak say you could sacrifice today in the house of Chunya? And there's another Mishnah. It says, once David and Shlomo came to Jerusalem, and they put up the Mikdash, the temple, Nesra Abamas, never again could you have a private altar. Never became permissible again. That's what Nachla means. The difference between Menucha and Nachla. Menucha means a rest stop. God took a rest stop for 369 years in Shiloh. Once he moved, this rest stop is not significant. Therefore, in those 50 years in between, Givon and Nov is permissible to have private altars. In theory, the house of Chonyo would be permissible then, according to various of opinions. How? It's not. There was no. It was for goyim. It was for small sacrifices. Let's say. But once Yerushalayim was put up, it's called nachla. It's an inheritance. That's my home. God said, "This is my home," and I'm not moving from Jerusalem. And therefore, it's never going to be permissible to sacrifice outside of Jerusalem. Not only that, it has to be exactly in the same spot of the where the temple had the altar. That's why it's not so simple, b'chlal, what people are trying to do today. Nachla means you cannot again, Rashi says, you cannot again put up sacrifices outside of Yerushalayim. That's what Yerushalayim did. It made it exclusive. Then no longer is there another option outside of Jerusalem for the Jewish people. Again, according to some opinions, it's the opinion of Tosfos, it was permissible to put up the house of Chunya in Egypt even after the building of the first and second temple. Why? Because he did it for Gentiles. The Rambam seems to hold also he did it for Gentiles. But the Rambam still says he violated the transgression of sacrificing outside of the temple. So Mishum Kasher Mori. The Reb Chaim. The Rambam says Reb Chaim asked the question. How could he ever have said such a thing? Did he not know the Mishnah? Everyone knows the Mishnah that says he's not allowed. What was the thinking of Rabbi Yitzchak? He asked another question. Later we're going to say that there's other people that maybe disagree with our Mishnah. So why did he walk back on it? I can hold like the opinion that doesn't agree with the Mishnah. So Rabbi Chaim says, therefore the answer is, this is an important point, Tosfos, because this Tosfos is effective till today in the law. Everyone agrees the Mishabari, the Yerushalayim, Nesra Abamis. Everyone agrees once Jerusalem is conquered, there's no opinion that says that you're allowed to put up an altar outside of Jerusalem. It was never permissible. There's an argument like this. The man the Omer Loikacha suffered the Afim Koimish Amazbech and Yoichan Lahakr Vachshav. This is that according to the opinion that says that it wasn't sanctified forever. It's not to make Jerusalem exclusive, it's to make the temple exclusive, which means today, according to this opinion that's brought down by Tosfos, if you were to go onto Temple Mount today and grab a goat and for whatever reason say, I know this is where the altar was in the times of the second temple, you're not allowed to sacrifice. Because once the temple was destroyed, no longer is the Makam HaMizbeach a place that you could sacrifice. The question is, how did they sacrifice before they put up the second temple? That's why I said it's not so simple. How they sacrificed in the time of the first in Ezra or in Zerubbabel before they put up the second temple. So others are going to say that they did make a sanctification, but today we don't have the ability to make a sanctification. Therefore, he says, according to the opinion Loikacha, that it was only sanctified as long as the temple stands. Even the place of the altar, you can't sacrifice to them. And the one that says that it was sanctified holds the that if you're able to find today, if you go to Temple Mount and you know for sure this is where the Mizbeach stood, you could take an animal today and sacrifice. Now I want to say this is seemingly to be the opinion that if you know where the place of the Mizbeach is today, you can sacrifice. According to tradition, I haven't seen it in writing, but according to tradition, Nachmanides, who came to Israel in the year 1200 or so, but at the end of his life, he had to run away from Spain. He considered sacrificing on Temple Mount. I'm not sure how he was able to do it technically with the Arab and Christian populations at the time. The Jewish people, when the Ramban came to Jerusalem, there wasn't even a minion of Jews living in Jerusalem. But there is, I think, a tradition that the Ramban wanted to sacrifice there. So if according to this opinion, the Temple Mount today, you can sacrifice. Means hypothetically, halachically, according to the second opinion brought down in the Tosfos, which seems to be the halachic opinion, which is our Mishnah, is that on Temple Mount, where our altar stood, you could sacrifice at all times. There's other problems that we have today. We don't have we have Tameh, but then you could say Tumah Barabim. There's a lot of halachic questions. It's not so simple. Like literally, if you go online before Passover, you'll see videos of people trying to sneaking goats to Temple Mount, and what they're planning to do there is to do the sacrifice of the Paschal lamb. All right, my time so Reb Steinzat says like this: As ultimately proven later, the Gemara, there is a Tanakh dispute as well as a dispute between Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish in Tractate Zvachim with regard to this matter. It's not so simple if Yerushalayim is sanctified forever. Therefore, there's no need for him to retract the statement. Some explain that he retracted his statement because two unattributed Mishnahs, our Mishnah, are very authoritative proof. And in the face of these proof, one cannot rely upon an opinion of individual Tana. Meaning to say is that though there's arguments, but the Mishnah, the fact that there's open Mishnahs and unnamed Mishnahs, which means to simplify that this is the law, means that Rabbi Yitzchak didn't want to stay with his opinion. Even though, again, Rabbi Yitzchak is holding two things. It could not according to Tosfos, but according to Tosfos, that even the opinions that say that it wasn't sanctified, is the opinion only means to say that the Temple Mount wasn't sanctified, and therefore you cannot today sacrifice with the Mizbeach was. Tosfos doesn't agree with what Rabbi Steinsaltz is saying. But according to the way some people are understanding the Gemara literally, Rabbi Yitzchak in theory, the house of Chunya in theory, if you could navigate all the questions in theory, you could sacrifice in the Temple of Chunya today if it's still in Egypt. Are very authoritative proofs in other individual Tanya. Rashba, so says the Rashba. Others write that initially Rabbi Yitzchak maintained that this dispute is parallel to the dispute between Rabbi Lezer and Rabbi Shua, as we're going to learn soon. Once that parallel is rejected and there's no proof that they disagreed on the issue, he retracted his statement. We have 4 minutes. Let's just learn a little bit of the next piece. I guess we're going to have to go to the Agada. They went too slow and too long, but I wanted to give you guys the full visual of the story. There's no point in just running through subjects and not knowing what we're talking about. So here he says like this: Tanya Tanoyi. There's a machlekes of Tanoim. Rabbi Lezer says, "Shemaiti, I heard." When they came in to build the second temple, you have to remember the second temple. They say that those who survived from the first temple to the second temple, it's not so crazy, right? 70 years. So you could be a 90-year-old person and have seen the first and second temple. So he or she cried. Those people cried because the second temple in the beginning, Herod's temple, was beautiful. But the second temple in the beginning was very simple. They didn't have a lot of money. They were very poor. But in the beginning, they didn't even have material to build a temple. So they just put up kloim. They put up curtains to kind of put up the position of the temple. So Rabbi Lezer heard, Shemati, I heard, how did they build the heichal, the sanctuary? Aisim kloim laheichal. They made curtains for the heichal. Ukloim lazar, and then they built another boundary of curtains for the Temple Mount, meaning where the temple space was the courtyard. So the courtyard had its curtains, and the actual heichal sanctuary had the curtains, but there was like what we called ki'ilu. It was an idea. It wasn't real. It wasn't a real temple. They built the heichal. When they built the heichal afterwards, they built it outside those curtains. And when they built the courtyard of the Beis HaMikdash, they built from inside those curtains. The reason is that according to most opinions, they didn't want to step into because they didn't want the layman, the regular worker, because what was the idea? Once they put up the curtains, it was sanctified. And that's how they were able to sacrifice the sacrifices, according to the opinion that says that you needed the sanctification of the second temple to put up the Mizbeach. And also they wanted the Mizbeach to be Pesach Oil Moed. They wanted it to be by the sanctuary. But once they put up the curtains gave it a certain significance of sanctity, and therefore they built it outside the curtain so the people shouldn't stand in what's called the heichal. It says Kalayim leheichal kasakataytach makam chaimes heichal. That where did they put the curtains? Where the walls should be. Shiyim mizbeach habani bazare kairei asher pesach almoy, because they put the curtains as a way of a replica for the walls for the actual temple. So then the Mizbeach, the altar where they sacrificed, again, they sacrificed for 20 odd years before they put up the second temple. They should be sacrificing what's called at the gate or the entrance of the oil mart of the sanctuary. Had they not put up the curtains, the understanding was they never would have sacrificed. Again, seemingly from Rashi. Why? Because you need the oil moed to sacrifice. Again, this is those who want to do a sacrifice today on the place where the Mizbeach is, based on what Rashi is saying, you can't. You have to have it Pesach Ol Moed. When did they start sacrificing? In Koresh's time. Now, you have to remember something else. Zerubbabel, which was a descendant of the house of David, either a grandson or great-grandson of Chonyo, of the second to last king, made the first aliyah. the Jewish people were already in Eretz Yisrael by the story of Purim. Under Koresh is Cyrus the Great. He let them come back, but he stopped the building of the temple. That's one of the stories of Achashverosh and Haman. That's why Achashverosh tells Esther she could only have half his kingdom up into the temple. So in the days of Koresh, they came back. That was before the story of Esther. As the story in the book of Ezra it says. And to 22 years it took from that, and in that was the story of Purim, until they came back again with Ezra in the times of Daryavush, the son of Esther. Only Daryavush, the last one, which was 22 years later, is when they put up the temple. So those 22 years they sacrificed. What was the basis of the sacrifice? Because they had the curtains that was the replica of the temple. Why did Rashi say, why did they build outside the curtains? Because they didn't want the builders to step on what was already sanctified as the sanctuary, although it was just curtains and there was no walls. All right, we're going to stop here. We're going to continue this Gemara, and Be'ez Hashem next week finish until back to the story of Purim. After we finish this sugya, we start with Agada, with the Gemara telling us, analyzing the whole story of Purim, which will be obviously interesting on its own. Laila Tov, everyone. Thank you for joining.